This video tutorial I will explain implementing user sign up, Spring security for user sign up, Spring security for user sign in, implementing get user details API call, adding XML support and JSON support, exception handling, update user details API call, delete user API call, pagination and get users API call, deploying the application, object relationship one-to-many relationship, Hacktios, implementing a password reset feature, testing code with JUnit 5 and Mockito, JUnit integration test, testing JWT tokens and user ID, testing RESTful web services with REST assured, using native SQL queries and Java persistent query language, cross-origin AJAX HTTP request, API documentation for REST API with Swagger, deploying to Amazon Cloud, AWS EC2, and implementing email verification feature with AWS SES, Simple Email Service. And we are going to use RESTful Web Services, Spring Boot, and JPA for these implementations. Here we will see web service application layers. There are three layers. The first one is presentation layer, second one is service layer, and the third one is data layer. And in presentation layer, we have user REST controller, and in service layer, we have user service, and data layer, we have user repository. Presentation layer is responsible for getting details from the client, and service layer where all the business related logic we have to write, and data layer is responsible for saving or retrieving data from the database. And here you can see the client. The client send user details request model for saving the user details information to the database, and user REST controller convert user details request model to user DTO and pass it to the user service. Then user service convert user DTO to user entity object, and using user entity object, user repository will save user information to the database. Suppose client want to get user information from the database, it sends request to the user REST controller. User REST controller sends request to the user service. User service calls user repository, and user repository fetch the user details, and it will be assigned to user entity object and pass it to the user service. User service convert user entity object to user DTO object and pass it to user REST controller. User REST controller convert user DTO object to user REST object and pass it to the client, so that client will get the user detail. Now we will see implementing user sign up, and here you can see the Postman client which sends user sign up request to the controller. User sign up request is nothing but user create request, and request reach the controller. Controller send user create request to the service layer, and service layer sends user create request to the repository layer, and repository layer saves user information in the database, and once it is successfully saved, user sign up response will be sent back to the Postman client. And controller we will be using user controller.java, and we have to apply REST controller annotation. Service layer we will be using user service impl.java, and we have to apply service annotation. Repository layer we will be using user repository.java, and we have to apply repository annotation. Here you can see Spring Boot demo project, and here you can see the package structure: controller package, DTO, entity, exception, model, under model, request and response, and UI, and repository, security, service, under service impl, utils, then resources. And here I have opened pom.xml file. Here I have included the dependencies of Spring Boot Starter Web, Spring Boot Starter Data JPA, MySQL Connector Java, Spring Boot Starter Security, and for JWT token, JWT, and Jackson Data Format XML. Here you can see application.properties file, and here I have given database URL. Database name is org_db, and username and password of database, and driver class name, and based on the domain model, the table will be created for that configuration. Here you can see org_db, and currently it does not have any tables. Here I have defined the class user controller, which is a REST controller, and here I have auto-wired user service object, and it has a create user method which accept user details request model object, and this method consumes either XML or JSON, and produces either XML or JSON. And in this method, what I am doing is I am checking the incoming request as email, and if it is empty, I am throwing user service exception. If the incoming request has a valid email ID, then I am creating a user DTO object, and using copy properties method of beanutils class, I am copying user details object values to user DTO object. Then I am calling create user method of user service object, and passing the user DTO object. And this method returns user DTO object, and using copy properties method of beanutils class, I am copying user DTO object values to user REST object. Then I am returning user REST object to the caller. Now we will see user details request model class, user DTO class, and user REST class. Here you can see the class user details request model. It has 4 properties: first name, last name, email, and password, and getter and setter methods for those 4 properties. And here you can see the class user DTO, which implements serializable, and it has properties like ID, user ID, first name, last name, email, password, encrypted password, email verification token, and email verification status, and getter and setter methods for these properties. And here you can see the class user REST. It has 4 properties: user ID, first name, last name, and email, and getter and setter methods for these 4 properties. Now we will see user service interface. Here I have defined the user service interface, which extends user details service interface, and it has abstract methods like create user, get user, etc. We will see create user method. This create user method accepts user DTO object, and returns user DTO. And here I have defined the user service impl class, which is a service class, and which implements user service interface and provide implementation of all the abstract methods which is there in the user service interface. And here you can see user repository object is auto-wired, utils object is auto-wired, and BCrypt password encoder is auto-wired. Here you can see create user method which accept user DTO object. And here what I am doing is I am checking the email is there in the users table or not. If email is there in the users table, then I am throwing a runtime exception, and messages record already exist. And if email is not there in the users table, I am creating a user entity object. Then I am copying property values from user DTO object to user entity object. Then I am generating a public user ID and setting to the user entity object, and encrypting the password and setting to the user entity object. Then I am calling a save method of user repository object and passing user entity object. This method will save the user details to the users table and returns user entity object. Then what I am doing is I am creating return user DTO object and copying property values from stored user entity object to return user DTO object. Then returns return user DTO object to the controller layer. Next we will see generate user ID method, and here you can see utils class. It is a component, and it has a generate user ID method, and inside it is calling generate random string method, and this method generates random public user ID. Next we will see user repository interface. And here you can see user repository interface, which extends paging and sorting repository interface, and it has two abstract methods, find by email and find by user ID. Now we will see user entity class. Here I have defined the class user entity, which implements serializable interface, and it is entity class, and this class is mapped to users table, and it has ID, user ID, first name, last name, email, encrypted password, email verification token, and email verification status properties, and getter and setter methods for these fields. Based on user entity domain class, this users table will be created, and it will have columns like ID, user ID, first name, last name, email, encrypted password, email verification token, and email verification status. And this ID column value will be auto generated because we have applied this annotation. And here we have mentioned user ID column should not be nullable, and first name column should not be nullable, and length should be 50. Like that, first name should not be nullable, and length should be 50, and email column should not be nullable, length should be 100, and values in the email column should be unique, and encrypted password column should not be nullable. Like that, email verification status column should not be nullable. Here I have defined the class application, which is Spring Boot application. And while starting this application, this BCrypt password encoder bean, and Spring application context bean, and app properties bean will be created, and it will be available in the Spring container. And here you can see BCrypt password encoder class. And here you can see Spring application context class, which implements application context aware and overrides set application context method. And it has a getBean method. When we pass bean name, it returns a particular bean. Here you can see app properties class, which is the component. And when you call get token secret, then it will get token secret value from the properties file. In application properties file, here you can see token secret. This value it will return. Now I am going to start this application in debug mode. Here you can see, based on the domain class user entity, users table is created. And application has been started successfully. Refresh. And here you can see two tables are created automatically when we started the application. The first one is Hibernate sequence. It has a next val column, and second table is users. It has columns like ID, email, email verification status, email verification token, encrypted password, first name, last name, and user ID. Same like user entity domain class. Now we will send user create request or user sign up request. For that we have to use this URL. HTTP method should be post. Click on body, click on raw, select JSON. Here I have put first name as Peter, last name as D, email as peter@gmail.com, password as pass123. Click on send. Request reached here, and incoming JSON is converted to user details request model object. You can see email is peter@gmail.com, first name is Peter, last name is D, and password is pass123. Here user DTO property values are copied to user entity object. Then public user ID is generated, and password is encrypted. Here we got stored user entity object. The user values are successfully saved into the database. then this user REST object will be returned back to the caller. Here you can see the user is successfully created, and user ID is this one, and first name is Peter and last name is D. Email is peter@gmail.com. We can check it in database, refresh, and here you can see email verification status, encrypted password, first name, last name, and user ID. This all created. So user create or user sign up is successful. Now I am going to send this user create request again. Click on send, and request reached here. Here I am checking the email ID is already there in the database. And if you see the email peter@gmail.com, it is already there in the database. So it will throw runtime exception saying record already exists. And here we got the error saying error ID is 301 and the error message. Record already exists. Next we will create the new user called John. First name John and last name, and email setting as empty. Click on send. Request reached here, and email is empty. So it will throw user service exception with the error message missing required fields. Missing required fields. Please check the documentation for required fields. And here we got the error. Error ID is 201, and the error message is missing required fields. Please check the documentation for required fields, and the timestamp when this error was created. You can get Java source code link for each video in the description section of the video. Here you can see the description section. Click on show more, and here you can see the Java source code links. Click on these links to get the Java source code.